This programme is about cooking and ironing. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to try and work out where I am. It's just possible that you know where we are, but if you do, shut up and let other people try to work it out. All of those shots were in Middlesbrough. Actually, that's not quite true. For some of them, we sneaked sideways into Redcar, but jolly nice they were, I'm sure you'll agree. Some cynical souls might even say surprisingly nice for Middlesbrough. I don't know what your experience of Middlesbrough is, but for me, well, I'm not from Teesside, I live in Newcastle. I actually come from Carlisle, and my first experience of the area was something like this view here. Driving down the A19 from the north, you suddenly get the whole place laid out in front of you. It's an extraordinary sight. It's one of those love it or hate it moments. No, that's not right. For me, it's actually one of those love it and hate it moments, because the mixture here is absolutely astonishing, isn't it? It's got mega industry, almost industry squared, but all set in a bowl of beautiful hills. What a combination. Is there anywhere else quite like it? And how on earth did it get to be like this? Well, until about the year 1830, there was nothing here, except the hills and the river and the landscape, nothing at all. Another lie. This is beginning to be a habit. I must stop. Of course there was something here. Until 1830, the landscape on which Middlesbrough now stands was countryside like anywhere else, a typical bit of rural North Yorkshire, littered with farms and little villages. They've all been swallowed up now in the later town, but you can still see them on the map, still with their old Saxon and Viking names. Places like Stainsby and Eston, Wilton and Ormesby, and Marton. This is Marton. When I first came here, I was quite surprised by it, because though it's deep in the heart of Middlesbrough, it's still got quite a villagey feel about it, with its medieval church, largely rebuilt in the 18-something or others, but still with a nice old atmosphere. There are old vicarages and picturesque almshouses and cottages and things. It must have been a real little village back in the days before Middlesbrough caught up with it. And it gave rise to at least one remarkable man who was born in 1728. Here. Or, possibly here. Or here. Or maybe here. Or somewhere around here in what is now Stewart Park in Marton. He was called James Cook, though you can call him Captain Cook if you don't mind. And he was one of the greatest Englishmen that ever lived, and certainly Middlesbrough's most famous son. I don't know exactly where he was born, because he came from a very ordinary family. His dad was a farm labourer, and he was brought up in a cottage which was presumably much too mean to have left any traces behind. What he's got instead is a nice monument made of Australian granite, and a very nice museum all of his own, which he deserves, because he was, what can one say, spiffing. To start from nowhere, from a humble cot in the northeast of England, to go on to conquer the world virtually, well, you can't do better than that. And he did, you know, conquer the world. He was the first person to sail round it in both directions. He discovered Australia and New Zealand, Antarctica. He was a fantastic mapmaker, a genius mapmaker and navigator. He conquered scurvy, that vitamin deficiency which, until his time, killed thousands of sailors on long voyages. He scored a hat-trick for the Borough in the 1762 Cup final. Actually, I made that bit up. He only scored once. But just in case you think I was exaggerating about the surviving bits of Middlesbrough's rural past, let me tell you that I was spoilt for choice about where to come next. I could have gone to the beautiful Ormesby Hall, which now belongs to the National Trust. I could have gone to Kirkleatham to see one of the greatest collections of early 18th century buildings in Britain. But I've filmed there before, been there, got the t-shirt. So I've come here instead, to Acklam Hall, which started life as a country house and became the town's grammar school and is now part of Middlesbrough College. It was built for a posh chap whose name escapes me in the 1680s, and most of what you can see now dates from that time. The porch was added later, and those rather top-heavy dormer windows were put on in early Victorian times, but the rest, the walls and the windows and so on, are original, and I have to tell you that they reveal that Teesside was no rural backwater in the 1680s. Acklam Hall was bang up to date. It wouldn't have seemed out of place in London. Sash windows were only invented about that time, and it was dead modern to be using them as early as the 1680s. This must have seemed a really fashionable house when it was built. It seems quite impressive to me that Middlesbrough should have a country house as posh as this within its boundaries, and you haven't even seen its really impressive bits yet. Wait till you see what lurks within. This is some of the finest decorative plasterwork in the whole of the north of England. Middlesbrough, as we know it now, started in 1830. That was when the chaps behind the Stockton and Darlington Railway, Quaker businessmen from Darlington led by Joseph Pease, were looking for a new deep-water port to export the coal of South Durham, and they bought a farm by the Tees. They extended their revolutionary new railway from Stockton and began to develop a new town around the port. Did well at first. In 10 years there were about 5,000 people living here, and you can tell from some of the surviving buildings that it was beginning to develop quite an attractive face. There was a customs house in a nice fashionable Greek Doric style. There was a new town hall with a sort of Italianate bell tower, and there must have been lots more of the same, but pretty soon things started to go wrong, and early success ran, as it so often does, into problems. Hartlepool, to name but all of them, Hartlepool was the source of Middlesbrough's early problems. A man called Ward Jackson started to build a new town and port at West Hartlepool, which was more convenient for the Durham coalfield, and it snaffled Middlesbrough's trade. So the infant Middlesbrough went into temporary decline. Psalm 121, beginning at the first verse. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. That's exactly it. Somebody did lift up their eyes into the Cleveland hills that rise so beautifully behind the town, and there they discovered a mine whose wealth was going to propel the town from its lowly non-league status into the premier division of industrial power and might. I feel such a twit because I'm not really sure what to call these hills. I think they're called the Cleveland Hills, or maybe the Cleveland Ridge. I suppose the whole lot is really just a sort of outlier to the North York Moors. But whatever it's called, it's totally gorgeous. But do you know that this spot upon which I stand is less than 3 miles from the very heart of Middlesbrough, probably just a couple. How many big towns can you think of where 10 minutes on a reasonably efficient pogo stick would get you out into countryside as beautiful as this? Where I am is known as the Eston Hills, and I'm standing on Eston Nab, which is the site of a prehistoric hill fort, an Iron Age hill fort no less, which is just a tad ironic, because this hillside turned out to be one of the richest sources of iron ore ever discovered. What happened was this. One day in 1850, a chap came up here for a walk. He wasn't just any chap, to be honest. He was called John Vaughan, and along with his partner, Henry Bolko, he owned blast furnaces over in County Durham and a rail-making factory down there in Middlesbrough. But his business was limited because all of the iron ore for his work had to be imported from further south, down in Yorkshire, from down around Gromont near Whitby, I think. But then, on that day up here in 1850, he walked into a wall of iron, almost literally. He came upon a cliff of ironstone sticking out of the ground and over 20 feet high, and the rest is history. Middlesbrough's industrial greatness was born. Middlesbrough became first of all the greatest iron town in the country, and later, when it moved over to steel, it became for a while the greatest steel town too. It provided iron and steel for the whole world. The world's railways were rolled in Middlesbrough, and the world's greatest bridges, from the Tyne to Sydney Harbour, started their lives here. The town's own greatest buildings, the astonishing Newport and Transporter bridges, are masterpieces of the steelworker's craft. Not pretty, but tough, uncompromising and thrilling. Middlesbrough's growth in population after the iron was discovered was astonishing. In 1851, there were only 7,500 people lived there. By the end of the century, 50 years later, that figure had soared to more than 90,000. Where did they all come from, and what for? They came from all over, as they say, from all over the country, from Scotland and Wales, from Cornwall and East Anglia, and they came for the money, for the rich pickings to be found in the furnaces and the mines of Teesside. It was like a gold rush. It's often called England's Klondike, but it started in 1850, just a year after the great Californian gold rush of 1849. So what did they call the first of the new settlements that were being thrown up to house the workers? They called it California. And here it is, California by the Tees. These houses look small enough, but they were being provided for workers who'd come here looking for better wages than were available elsewhere. And by the standards of the day, they were pretty impressive. Each family got a bit of privacy, a variety of spaces, and of course, they got a home of their own. Over the next 50 years, tens of thousands of working-class brick terraced houses were built. All of them quite efficiently planned and designed, a lot of them with quite nice brick details, but none of them all that special. Middlesbrough was essentially a company town, or at least a company's town, like a huge pit village. But at the same time, it began to develop a town centre, a real urban heart. The most famous comment about Middlesbrough in those early expansive days was made by the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, who described the place as an infant, but an infant Hercules, which I take to mean that he thought it wasn't very old, but it was likely to grow up into something really powerful. And indeed, during those later Victorian days, the place did seem to show a confidence and an energy which came straight from the blast furnaces. So you see, Middlesbrough's not short of good buildings, but if I was being honest, as soon as you hear somebody say something like that, you know that they're going to be a bit unkind, and it's true, I am, because if I was being honest, I'd have to say that despite all of the fab buildings that we've been looking at so far, and despite the ring of surviving country houses in the suburbs, Middlesbrough isn't really the first place you'd come to if you wanted to see great buildings or great townscapes. I suspect the problem is that the town was built too recently and too fast to develop the rich patina that older towns have got. The streets here in the town centre are quite wide, as if they were laid out with the ambition to be grand, but the buildings are quite low and not quite grand enough. And the effect, oh Lord, I said I was going to be unkind. The effect is that somehow the town, on the whole, seems spacious but unexciting. And while I'm being grumpy, I might as well mention that there have been other problems too. Very obvious ones. Very common ones, I'm afraid, all over the country, but Middlesbrough's had more than its fair share. Many of the old industries have faded and Middlesbrough has been left with too much industrial wasteland. The whole of the original town down by the riverbank has been left in an intensely depressing state. Mind, it's not just the fault of fading industry, it's at least partly the fault of this scabby road. This is the elevated section of the A66, which was cut through the middle of the town in the 1980s, slicing the place in two, cutting off the river and the old town, which is over in this direction, from the rest of the place, which is over on the other side of this blinking wall. It's an unbelievable piece of town planning. It's a boot job. Crush the A66 beneath the great boot of history. This is King Edward Square, and it's part of the University of Teesside. These terraces are student accommodation. The square wasn't originally designed like this. It was made out of a couple of ordinary terrace streets that were built at right angles to each other. So they knocked down one side of each street and created this nice public square. It's good, isn't it? Makes me want to be a student again. You could roll into lectures from there. This is the new entrance into the university off Borough Road. This is good too. An excellent mixture of old and new. I've come to the university because I want to introduce the idea that Middlesbrough isn't standing still and just putting up with the sort of problems that I was on about a minute or two ago. The iron mines might be a thing of the past. Steel may be less reliable than it was. But my impression is that the town is looking forward, looking for new identity. The university here is one of those forces looking to the future, but there's a lot more. There's a new contemporary arts centre being built, and there are gigantic plans for the redevelopment of the decayed waterfront. But in the meantime, there's plenty of gleaming new design to enjoy in this Victorian town. Well, here I am at the mouth of the Tees, and well, what sort of stone do you reckon that is, eh? It's quite heavy, nicely rounded, bobbly in places. It's shiny even here, quite almost iridescent. In fact, I can reveal that this is not stone at all, but a lump of iron slag from the blast furnaces of Victorian Teesside. Who would have thought that a piece of iron slag could be so beautiful? This whole landscape at the mouth of the river was built on industrial slag like this, dumped in Victorian times to create new banks for the river. Teesside as a whole is a bit like that, because it was built on a foundation of industry too, and it's an odd sort of place. There's an awful lot of it, of course, that you couldn't call beautiful by any stretch of the imagination, and yet I think it's a fascinating place. I think that is a unique landscape, and whatever you think, he said rather aggressively, I'm going to make it my Grundys Wonder.